next session that we're going to have is entitled Alice, an Inclusive Economic Development with Dr. Sharice West Scantlebury, CEO of the Winthrop Rockefeller Foundation. But before she comes up, I have this great honor to say this. I've been waiting so long to say this. I've never gotten a chance to introduce her, and this is a very special moment for me because she gave me my first job while I was in grad school and afterwards, and I really appreciate you, so thank you. Sharice West Scantlebury is the leading 21st century equity advocate. From her early beginnings as a housing advocate in New York City to leading programs at some of the most prestigious foundations in the southeastern United States, Sharice has been relentless in her quest to increase prosperity for families striving to move out of poverty. Sharice uses every opportunity to speak life into leaders and organizations, such as myself, thank you, and she encourages them to use their talents to solve our country's most urgent challenges. Her public policy, strategic philanthropy, and program development expertise makes her a maker and one of our nation's top transformational leaders. Please welcome to the stage Dr. Sharice West Scantlebury.
You're great. Just fabulous. All right, so Ms. Kendra gave me the charge of talking about the who in this inclusive economy, the who of what we're talking about when we talk about opportunity and the like. So the who of this, right? So you heard sort of like the what, like what can be done in a construction trade, right? But then someone has to actually work in that building, live in that building, or whatever it is. So so I'm going to talk about the who. And I'm going to talk about Alice. Alice. A is for asset, L is for limited, I is for income, C constrained, E employed. Asset limited, income constrained, employed. That's what I mean when I talk about Alice. The key to all of that is employed, because I'm going to demystify who is Little Rock, who is Arkansas, right? So in our state, and these are 2015 numbers, and unfortunately they haven't changed a whole lot over the years. 70% of the jobs in our state, 70%, 70% of our jobs in our state require less than a high school diploma and do not pay a living wage. For Little Rock, that living wage for an adult with no kids is $15.95 an hour. And for two adults with one child, now we're not talking about 3, 4, and 5, but just even one child, is $17.93. And by living wage, what I'm speaking of is food, clothing, shelter, transportation, and childcare. I'm talking about getting your hair done. I'm not talking about going to the movies. I'm talking about being able to eat, feed, clothe, get to where you need to get to your job, most likely, and quality childcare for kids so that we can go out and work, right? So that's how that number is calculated. It is a number that was developed by the United Way to go a little further than poverty, which just focuses in on food and shelter, not so much clothing or transportation or any other things, just food, being able to feed yourself and being able to house yourselves. So the reason I want to start there, and I'm not trying to throw out a whole bunch of statistics, but when we talk about the who in this inclusive economy, right? And that inclusive economy is one that is defined as where everyone can participate, right? Where everyone can participate. The key is that everyone is participating in our economy in Arkansas. Arkansans work. When we talk about poverty and chronic poverty, we're talking about a little less than 12% of the entire population. And so much of the focus is there, which it should be, let's be clear. There are a lot of kids in poverty, a lot of folk experiencing poverty. So we're not dissing those in poverty at all. But that group of folk, who are mainly most of us, who are working, we've done everything you said to do. We got a high school diploma, some of us even have an advanced degree. But in our state, 70% of our jobs require less than a high school diploma, or less, and do not pay a living wage. Our minimum wage is $11. The poverty wage is around $5 or $6.53. $5.54 for 2 adults with children. Again, these are based on 2020 numbers. So I'm not going back in history. I'm talking about pretty recently. And anything I say can be verified through the U.S. Department of Economic, through data that I got from the U.S. government, not data that I made up in my office. This is actual verifiable data. Now, so when we talk about this who of this inclusive economy, there's one other piece that is important to talk about here, and that is that when Arkansas does not include everybody in its economy, we lose $8.4 billion with a B dollars in taxable wages, $6.9 billion in consumer spending, for a net gain of $2.2 billion that our state could be using for for roads, construction, for all other things. So when we don't include everyone in our economy, we actually have a net loss of $2.2 billion. So it behooves us to figure out, and I'm not here with the answers. I was just told to tell you who we're talking about. But when we don't figure out this, we continue to lose that $2.2 billion with a B dollars each year. That's not even over a year. I'm talking about each year we're losing this amount of money. So when we think about inclusive and being inclusive in this economy, we have to talk about ALICE. Now, before they were called working poor, and because we want to be positive in how we talk about ourselves, no one wants to be described as working poor, right? But ALICE is the term that the United Way has developed to talk about asset-limited, income-constrained employed folks. So again, I want to dispel, this is not chronic poverty because we're talking about Arkansans' work. We have, as you all know, a very low unemployment rate. We're like in the single digits, like all of us are working, but we're not working at jobs that pay a living wage. Now, I'm not even talking about benefits. We're not even talking about health benefits and the like, because what our study has found is that many of these adults are actually putting together 2, sometimes 3 jobs and still not getting benefit. So can we imagine an economy in Little Rock, but even in our state, where you just got one job? And that one job enables you to not just feed and shelter yourselves, but also have transportation, childcare, and the like. Housing, transportation, and childcare are the keys to this ALICE number. So why is it important to know our who? It is important to know our who and the magnitude of our who, because we continue to tell ourselves narratives and we hold on to old stories. And those stories just need to go away. And part of what the foundation is trying to do is actually switch that narrative, provide the solid data so that we can have real conversations about who our Arkansans are and who the citizens of Little Rock are. These are citizens who are working. These are citizens with education. We have teachers who don't make enough money to make ends meet. We have dental hygienists who do not make enough money to make ends meet in our state. Good jobs, wonderful jobs. We're telling all of our kids to go get you one of these jobs, right? And where are our kids living? Some probably in that same room they was in when they were 12, right? So we can't even get rid of our kids, right? As much as we went, maybe that might be me. I do love my son. We only got one, so he has to be my favorite. But every now and again, I would wish Preston would go place else to live. But he can't afford it, right? So that is our who here in our state, is that ALICE, are those ALICE families. And I say families because the other myth to bust is that these are not all single parents. And they're not all Black. The majority of ALICE in our state is white. The majority of ALICE in Pulaski County is white. So again, we have these images and stories that we tell ourselves over and over and over again about who's experiencing challenges. And those challenges are all of us, all of our neighbors, all of our colleagues, all of us. But it's not the poor welfare queen Black mother at all, okay? At all. This is Arkansans working, trying to make ends meet, but simply cannot. So what is some of the work that we're doing at the foundation to not just bring this to light, but also to support those who are working on ALICE? So for us at the foundation, we see our role as providing this data on ALICE, ALICE reports, ALICE dashboards, and the like, because we need all Arkansans to understand and know that we need policies that do not hurt our ALICE families. And unfortunately, in our state, we actually have public policy that is hurting the fabric of the families. The meat of the families in our state are families who are working 1 to 2 jobs, but not making enough money to cover all of their expenses. These are not trifling folk who made bad decisions. We can't brush this off as, because if that was the case, when you're talking about 70% of our jobs not paying a living wage, the two don't go together. They just don't. I mean, it doesn't make logical sense, and it doesn't make good public policy sense. Childcare being such key to this, housing being such a key to this, and transportation. Now we know in our state, which is mainly rural, transportation has always been the challenge that it's always been. We also know that especially in some of our rural communities, getting the kind of childcare and getting to childcare, again, is just a challenge. And housing has always been a long-term challenge. Providing housing for those who make $50,000 or less in our state, like that is who we need to start building housing for. That is where we need to direct policy towards. Because building that house has always been that way or that gateway to leverage your business, send your kids off to college, using your home equity loan to improve your own housing in your own state, right? But for those who can't access that, and they can't access it not because of their fault or character flaws, but simply there is no house in my income bracket if I make $50,000 or less to purchase. So if there's no house to purchase, how are you calling me trifling? I don't get it. It doesn't make sense. If childcare is well beyond my means, and childcare in our state is about $13,000 a year, that's on average. I know some of y'all paying more than that. I know that, but I'm talking about an average. Again, an average that I get from our state's website. If that's the cost, and you're not even making the $80,000 a year to even get you there, right? And then housing, at one point, 30% of your income was considered a good ratio. Housing has gone upwards of 50% of people's income. So again, this is, what I'm talking about is systemic change. This isn't about individual failure or character flaws. Because is it a character flaw if I can only get a job that pays less than a living wage? Is that a character flaw? That's a systemic problem. So how do we then go about in our city, but even in our state, to attract employers and say to them, you must pay a wage of $16 an hour or more? Why must we continue to market ourselves as a low-wage state, which just exacerbates our challenge? For all things around, and I'm sure we've all read the paper about how many of us, many folk got left off of the Medicaid rolls and the like, right? So again, working 2 or 3 jobs, 1 to 2 jobs, not many 3, they were mainly 1 to 2 jobs, that do not pay any other benefits, none. Right? But then the Medicaid expansion and the like comes up for conversation year after year after year, and it's always spoken of in this very deficit, negative frame. But again, your dental hygienist may need that Medicaid. We have folk who are working who have to access state and federal benefits simply because their jobs are not paying those benefits. Again, I want to speak this plainly and as clearly as I can, and again, anything I say can be substantiated. Because the narrative of character flaws, personal responsibility, and fault, we need to switch that conversation. And we need to figure out how do we undergird our families in such ways that they can thrive, not survive, because this $15.95 for an adult and $17.93 for 2 adults and a child, that's a survival wage. That's not a thriving wage. That's survival. So how do we even get to that survival level and push ourselves towards our families thriving? And that is the question. How do we build an economy in which all of us participate? And this isn't all about job training, right? Because we want to like to throw things there. Job training, sure, absolutely. Especially young people who are just now entering the market, absolutely job training. But chances are that 30-year-old or that 45-year-old probably don't need a whole lot of job training, right? They just need a job that pays a living wage. So it's not just job training, right? It's not just, well, you know, you're in medical debt and student loan debt, oh well, right? It's like, no, you know, those debt, they weren't quite developed in ways that were good, right? And so that level, and again, I'm not talking about your credit card debt. I'm just speaking about medical debt, student loan debt, right? Again, systemic. Healthcare in general, writ large, systemic. Transportation, systemic. The ability for affordable housing, systemic. But all of these policies were man-made, and man can unmake them and develop them in ways that support our families. So at the Winthrop Rockefeller Foundation, we are providing this data. We are supporting nonprofit organizations that are working to ensure that no adverse policies are developed that hurt our ALICE families. Some of you are grantees in this room, and even others who want to be grantees. Any conversations you want to have about the work you're doing to provide services, supports, and advocacy for ALICE families, we want to join you and you to join us. And then the final thing that we are doing is working and coming to rooms such as these to talk with business leaders, policy makers, stakeholders, and the like, to do our part, to use our reputational capital and the like, to make sure that these leaders know and understand who our Arkansans are and how policies can negatively impact 70% of our families in our state. The 70%, you cannot tell me we got 70% of our population that's just trifling and got bad character flaws. Because that means we're all pathological in that case. Some things are, and I'm not taking away from anybody who's out there not doing what they're supposed to be doing, but that's not 70%. We actually have a systemic challenge, and a challenge that we as the city of Little Rock, and even in our state, we actually have to have a conversation about, what can we do differently? Otherwise, we will continue to be a state of low-wage workers. And we can change our future, but changing that future requires innovation, creativity, and quite honestly, just boldness and courage. So how do we get the boldness and courage to actually change our policies and our practices so that we support our families and not continue to hurt our families? So that is the who. So from there, I'll stop. I think I have 5 minutes. Any questions, thoughts, things to share? Yes, ma'am.
So many of Arkansas's Alice families are employed by the largest employer, which is the state of Arkansas.
Mhm.
Even within this corridor is several state agencies or universities. So how do we start those conversations and changes and advocate for them as employees and a community in a state that actively promotes the rainy day fund and revenue while not continuing to increase the base salaries and minimum wage that's needed? So how can we actively engage in those conversations and help support movements like this?
Sure. So Children's Hospital, we had a conversation with them recently. They did a benchmarking of their current salaries, and they moved pretty much everyone up to the Little Rock living wage. The same was done at the water department. Oh, I forgot the Central Arkansas Water. Central Arkansas Water did the same. And we also had the city of Forest City took a look at that and their rainy day fund and said, you know, with this investment, we can actually move all of our city employees up to the living wage here in Forest City. So there are people who are doing it. It just literally take a look and benchmark it. And from there, have the conversation. It's not that easy because, you know, you can't just go in there and be like, oh, here's the data, you need to, you know, increase all our wages to the living wage, right? I mean, you actually have to make the argument for it, but you got to start with what is the data and who it is that we're speaking of. The second thing is, and I know the state does pay benefits, so sometimes you get that whole, well, you get this, but you get the benefits, you know, and totally your package is X, right? But you're like, but I still can't make my mortgage payment, right? Off of this salary. So again, it becomes a conversation, but how terrific would it be for state government to make that commitment to pay all of its employees a living wage? All of them, janitors, aides, whomever you are, that you at least start at that living wage. And so, yeah, so that's how you have to start the conversation with what is the current data. The other is, if you wanted to go just a step further, which I know some employers have done, was even to find out who owns a home, who rents. So one of the folks that we're working with, for example, that $50,000, they found that the average salary was $50,000. And so how do you then get housing products developed for those who make $50,000 or less so that they can actually get into home ownership? And so that company is now working on just that question. But they didn't know that was a question until that data was presented to them. So that's where it needs to start, is with the data.
Of the items that you pose that were a challenge, whether it's the transportation, daycare, affordable housing, which one, either in your opinion or data-driven, do you think would make the biggest impact to attack to aid and assist the people that are living at the Alice level?
So we saw in the pandemic, and in particular, childcare. Childcare. It was stark in the pandemic. It was stark before the pandemic, but nobody was paying nobody no mind, right? And so now, I don't say post-pandemic because I actually know people today who got COVID, right? So, you know, in this time that we are moving out of maybe the hysteria of it, childcare becomes one that needs to be really, really tackled. And childcare needs to be tackled in a number of fronts. Most childcare workers do not make a living wage. So we actually need to, and many of our childcare workers, you have to have an advanced degree to work in some of these centers. So again, these are folk who did everything we asked them to do. They went to school, they got a degree, they got a job, but a job in this state that does not pay a living wage. And many of them are women. And so, you know, tackling, even making sure that our childcare workers make enough to support their own families is one front that we need to deal with, in addition to how do we make it accessible and affordable and quality for all who need to access it, especially those who cannot make that $13,000 a year price tag. So childcare would be that.
Good afternoon. My name is Kyle Lane, Realtor with Plush Homes and owner of Gray Slate Digital. One question I have is, in today's political climate, how do we communicate economic equity and empowerment in a way that penetrates beyond political views and more on the heart level? Because what you're saying is definitely a heart issue, but there's a wall that many people in this state have for things that you're talking about.
Absolutely. You're absolutely right. And so it's two fronts. One is we have stories of those who are ALICE currently in our state, and we actually have collected those stories. Kyra, who's one of our consultants, has been working with us in collecting those stories. Reverend Chantal Hinton Hill at WRF is the one who's leading that. So we do tell and present the stories of those who are ALICE to policymakers, business leaders, and the like, because it's through stories, really, that you get there. However, there is a bottom line, and there is a cost to having ALICE in our state, and that is that $2.2 billion per year that we lose. And so when we do talk to business leaders, many of them who say they can't afford to raise their salaries up to that living wage, like that's what you hear over and over and over again. But we also saw in the pandemic, when folk weren't coming back to work because they said, I'm not coming back to your job that don't pay well, that some of them salaries did manage to go up. So we know it's not impossible for that to happen. But how do we have that push? So there is this bottom line of we are losing $2.2 billion per year net gain in our state that could be used for a whole lot. I mean, $2.2 billion could go a long way in improving a whole lot around here, right? So we're losing that amount. And when we talk about that amount and what that loss is, we actually can engage in a conversation that doesn't pull at the heartstrings, but actually gets to a bottom line. So it's both fronts.
Thank you. We have one remaining question.
Thank you so much. This whole discussion today has been rich. I'm Natasha. I'm a professor at Philander Smith University, but I also serve on the Dunbar Neighborhood Association nonprofit with Angel Bird, and she'll be here shortly. But the discussion about homes, we relocated here to Atlanta, from Atlanta about a year ago, and there's a gentleman whose name is Booker T. Washington, and he is building tech homes. And I've engaged him in dialogue, and what he's doing is coming back into areas like Dunbar, rather than allowing people to build $300,000 homes, pricing out the community, and of course, bringing in gentrification. Of course, we want to see our communities beautified. Well, why put up a $300,000 home when you can put up a tech-savvy $140,000 home and allow single parents to get a part of the American dream?
Yes.
And so we saw it on stage, as the gentleman from the Chamber of Commerce initially stated. This is the American dream. These two gentlemen who have different backgrounds, different ethnicities coming together. And we're only as strong as all of us. America's a melting pot. This is a discussion brought together through DEI with the city, and it means that leadership has to embrace this as well. And so I think when there are areas in areas like Dunbar where you have vacant lots, the city could probably partner with private entities to come in to build these homes. And of course, they get maybe some government supplements to allow these particular properties to be renovated, but to put up homes that people can actually afford. But I would love to know if there are difficulties for a company like this particular company, Tech Homes, to come into a city and say, hey, we're going to build smaller, more affordable homes. Would they run into problems maybe with some of the other developers who are trying to purchase those properties and then rebuild a larger home so they can get more bang for the buck out of those lots? And he's actually like doing it because they're building up small houses and they're actually able to put more homes, which means more people can buy. So what types of problems would they face coming into Arkansas, with the powers that be?
Sure. So I'm going to answer that in a couple ways. One of which is I did mention home ownership, but let me just say, it ain't nothing wrong with renting. Please, my God, can we some kind of way figure out how to develop rental housing? Most of us rented before we owned, most of us. And, I know in the US, the American dream is for everyone to own a home, and some kind of way you're a loser if you rent. I don't get it, but that's the way it is. Sometimes you got to rent. Sometimes folk don't want to own. Like, I actually don't want to cut my grass. Right? I actually like it when someone shows up and exterminates. Right? And again, that may be a preference. So, with that said, let's, in this policy, in this conversation, make space for both. Now, with that said, you have so much, again, this gets back to values and who has the most power. The value is home ownership. The ones in power are those who can build those $200,000 homes. They have the strongest lobby, and that's your biggest obstacle. They have the strongest voice, right or wrong, indifferent, they do. Those that we're trying to fund to build that voice, for every $1 we give them, those other folk have over $500. So the voice for affordable, quality ownership and rental, that is a barrier because they can't be heard because they're drowned out. And we have to figure out, WRF is doing this, we have other funders who have joined us in this, we just have to figure out how to build stronger voice amongst those who are developing those types of products for those who are within that ALICE range. So policy is a challenge, the whole not in my backyard, because the minute you talk about affordable housing, you got everybody and their mama trying to come to the city hall or wherever they're trying to go to stop that development. And again, that's about perceptions of who folk are. Now, if I asked, and you don't have to, I bet you 80% of the hands in this room will go up saying that you came from an ALICE family. And wouldn't you want somebody to live next door to you? Again, the perceptions that these are low-income people coming into our community. I said 45 times they work. These are not folks sitting around getting government check or these are people who are going out there doing their hustle. But they are outnumbered, outvoted, outgunned because the voice is not there for this type of product. That is one of the biggest obstacles that has to be overcome. It really is. That next obstacle that has to be overcome is around perception and narrative. Because you're building products for those who make $80,000 or $50,000 or less does not mean our whole neighborhood going to go to hell in a handbasket. Or because you're developing rental housing, the whole community is going to go to hell. But we seem to not be able to get that out of our brains, abilities, and the like. Just can't do it. And that too is a big push. And then the third one is these folk have to be funded. WRF is only one funder. While we have $140 million in assets, even if I gave one nonprofit all of those dollars, it will not solve that problem. So we have to fortify our affordable housing developers to be able to connect with a Dexter and a Jake, who actually are lovely and have been doing this type of work. But then you have others who either refuse or don't participate or whatever the case may be. And we just have to figure out collectively as a state, how do we get products to these folks? So policy is a barrier, voice and building capacity is a barrier, and narrative, not in my backyard, is also a barrier. And those are big ones to overcome, but they can be overcome. And I see Amber doing the inch up, telling me it's time for me to sit down, but thank you.